Hello, welcome. Don't worry, we are open, but we will be discussing adapting the close and confirming the partnership. Objectives today. First is understanding proper attitude. What type of attitude do we need to close the sale? What are some guidelines for closing the sale? What are some closing clues for closing the sale? What are some methods for closing the sale? And what happens when they actually say yes, but also what happens when they say no? So what should we do in that case as well? Now the big picture in our sales process, we're finally at the close. And again, remember, we've gone through a long process, so the close should be natural at this point. First, let's discuss the attitude. So remember, when we are taking the position in a selling situation, we really have to assume the responsibility for obtaining a commitment from the customer, right? That's almost the expectation that they even have from the customer's point of view. So some closing methods can just move the customer from that indecision to a commitment. And when they're used effectively, the customer shouldn't feel any pressure. It should feel like a natural step. So in these cases, we need to really replace any defense-arousing language, such as this is the lowest price available anywhere, with a more positive need satisfaction question, such as, wouldn't this event help you achieve a greater awareness for your association? Remember, we're still consulting, we're asking the questions. We're not trying to force anyone, we're not closing, you're not shoving a sale down somebody's throat. Closing the sale is usually easier if you look at the value proposition from the customer's point of view. And really, we should be asking 3 questions. And again, if we're doing a proper sales presentation, we should be doing this anyway. But first is, have we effectively summarized the mix of benefits and buying conditions? We're going to be doing that in our presentation. What we'll also be doing is making sure our proposal provides a solution that solves the customer's problem. And finally, we just want to make sure that it's strong enough to win over or handle any objections that the customer might have. So again, we're removing those concerns, those anxieties. And just remember that the attitude you should have is to be empathetic and consultative even during the closing of the sale. Now, another great book, if you have some time, is this Tom Riley book on value-added selling. And really what he says, the main focus is that you don't actually close sales. You build commitments to a course of actions that brings value to the customer and profit to the seller. And this really aligns with our guidelines that we'll talk about right now. First is a matter of focus. So again, when we start off this whole sales process, we're really trying to understand discover the buying conditions of the buyer, and that's our focus when we're trying to close the sale, even present the sale. We want to make sure that we're really focusing on the conditions and the motivations of that specific seller. Another guideline we should remember is that, just as we've done in this example in our role play, when there's long and complex selling cycles, even every time the client agrees to continue to meet and discuss, that demonstrates an incremental achievement or commitment. So just think of the close as just the next logical step in that commitment in the sales process, okay? And that's something that we really have to remember, is that the close is not necessarily the most important or the most challenging part. It's just another part of the process. Another area that we need to be aware of, and again, we've discussed about negotiating the tough points, is we want to make sure that we've dealt with any buying conditions, because realistically, there's always at least one potential problem. We touched on price being the most common, so we just want to make sure that we have dealt with it in a positive manner and had that mutual satisfaction in terms of negotiating that challenge. Speaking of understanding the customer, we should also avoid any surprises at the close. So again, because of the sales process, because we've been so thorough, we've asked great questions, we shouldn't have any surprises at the end, okay? But if they do arise, then we need to really review the sales process more thoroughly. But again, if we've done it successfully, we shouldn't really have to worry about any surprises. And this goes hand in hand with that confidence. Again, if you remember, one thing you don't want to do is apologize for the price. Well, this is the same idea, is that you want to exude confidence in your sale, in your product that you're offering. Because remember, you know that you've done your homework. You know that the client is getting the right solution for their challenges or for what they're trying to achieve. So it's so important to feel confident when you're making that close, understanding that you are actually helping out your client. And finally, you can ask for the order more than once, or ask for the close more than once. It's okay to ask a couple times. In fact, it's more likely that that's going to happen. Usually, the research shows about the fourth or the fifth attempt is when the close actually becomes official, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just remember, again, with all the buying concerns, sometimes there's a reason why it may not always close immediately. Now, in terms of when we should be closing, or when there's some opportunities, let's take a look at some closing clues. Now, there's some verbal clues, right? So sometimes the client might ask some good question. Now, what do we mean by a closing clue? Let's first talk about this first. So really, it's an indication, either verbal or nonverbal. Here we'll discuss verbal, that the prospect is preparing to make a buying decision. So really, it's just a form of feedback. And this is really critical in selling, is understanding these clues, because that's a good opportunity or time to attempt to close. And these clues can be subtle, so it's very important to be aware. So let's first look at our verbal clues. First, the client might ask some questions. So certain questions might imply the interest of a sale. For instance, if the buyer or the client asks, well, you need to put down a deposit for reserving this many rooms, that's a good indication where the client might be making that buying decision. Another is recognitions. So perhaps the clue is that they recognize, the client might say, oh, it'd be pretty amazing to hold our event in this room. Well, that's a great closing clue that they're really interested in making this decision. And finally, the client might verbalize some requirements. So for instance, they might say, well, the lighting will need to be adjusted during the speeches. So they're already really envisioning having this meeting here, but they're moving forward and actually thinking about some requirements. So these are some excellent closing clues. And I really encourage in your role play to include them so that you can make a more realistic and natural sales presentation that involves the final close. So this is our verbal. Let's move on to our non-verbal. So when we're discussing nonverbal, there's some few indications. First, we'll discuss body movement. Okay, so what type of body movement would show some sort of engagement? Well, really, obviously, if the prospect is nodding in agreement to many things, that's a good indication. Perhaps the prospect leans forward and appears to be intent on hearing your message. Or even if the prospect's really taking a look at your proof devices. So again, remember, you're going to be including some sort of proof device. Sometimes they're not physical, but if you did have a physical pamphlet, they might want to look at it. That's a good indication where they're really studying intently. Good opportunity to perhaps ask for a close. So that's what we mean by body movement. Facial expressions, obviously, if the client has their eyes really open, they show very interest and engagement, even having a positive smile on their face, that could show that they're really engaged in this opportunity and might be a good time to close. In terms of positivity, the tone of the voice. So even when they're speaking or asking those or answering your confirmation questions, if they're very positive and enthusiastic, well, that looks like it might be that time to attempt a close. So these are, again, all some good signals that you can consider, both verbal and nonverbal. And really think about what type of dialogue, what type of communication you're going to have between the buyer and the seller in your sales presentation so that the closing method or the attempt of these closes are appropriate when you're deciding to attempt a close. And as always, we have a worksheet that you can use, and this will help us have an opportunity to practice. And again, in terms of the closing methods, there are a lot out there. I don't want you to get bogged down on all of them in terms of applying them, but just be aware of some different types of methods that are available. So first, an example here, and there are some videos as well that you get to watch as well, but we'll talk about the direct appeal close. So this is a very straightforward manner. Really, you're just asking for the order, you're asking for the business, very straightforward. It's obviously a direct closing approach, and this can be very attractive for the buyer, particularly if they feel confident with you, if you've gone through the process of this sales process. They really have a good understanding that it's much likely that this is the type of close that you might ask, okay? Now, of course, this type of close shouldn't come too early, so it's important, again, to wait for those closing clues, okay? So here's an example, again, of that closing clue. Remember that recognition clue that we discussed? So imagine the client says something like this. Well, this might be an opportunity to ask something like this. So yes, here is our closing attempt, right? And we're really getting a direct question, can I get your signature on this event order? Okay, so that's an example of a direct appeal of close. You can see the closing clue that might be appropriate and making that closing statement by the salesperson. Let's look at another example here. We have multiple options close. Okay, so this is another closing method. When would we use this method? Well, perhaps here, this is another closing clue. This is a question that the client is asking. Again, example from what we used previously. If they're thinking about how they're going to purchase or put down a deposit or book or save these rooms, here's your option. And again, what you're doing is just basically giving them two methods. So you're giving them multiple options on how they can book this event. Okay. So again, another example of a multiple option or another closing method. This is the multiple option. And again, there are many different examples. I want you to think about what you would like to do. Be a little creative. There's no right or wrong method. Let's take a look at another one. We have the assumptive close. Okay, so this assumptive close really asks for a minor decision, assuming that the customer has already decided to buy. Sometimes we call this the take it for granted close. This closing approach comes near the end of a planned presentation, so this could be appropriate for what we're doing in our role play. And this closing method provides a subtle way to ask for a decision when you're quite certain the customer has already decided to buy. Okay, so if we're quite certain the customer has already decided to buy, it's likely we have a good relationship with them. We've gone through a really effective sales presentation. The FBR approach has been successful. They've been confirming with us a lot of positive closing clues. Okay, but let's take a look at a requirement clue that the customer might say during the presentation, right? So again, they might sort of already expect to be booking with you, and they might talk about something about the lighting as a requirement, okay? So in this case, we can definitely respond with absolutely. We can go over those adjustments after you sign the event order, okay? So we're already assuming that we've already booked the event, and now we're just moving on to dealing with one of the requirements. So this is what we mean by assumptive close. What's that? You want another example? Okay. Here's another example of the summary of benefits. Okay, so summary of benefits is a goal to re-emphasize the value-added benefits that can help bring about a favorable decision. Because of this tactic is also referred to as a step-by-step close. This closing statement gives you an opportunity to restate the value proposition from the customer's perspective. Always keep in mind that you should have an empathetic perspective. Now, if you think about this, the summary of benefits close is very similar to what you're going to be doing in terms of your presentation. Because remember, you're going to start with your summary of benefits. You're going to work through each buying condition. And then finally, you're probably going to close with a summary of benefits. So in a way, you're actually, your sales presentation really works towards this as well, okay? So, but don't forget, you might ask, you're going to be attempting multiple closes. So you can actually use a number of these different methods when you're creating your role play, okay? So take a moment, maybe pause the video, do some reading here. But again, This is what we mean by a summary of benefits close. Now, we did discuss adapting the customer's or adapting the close. And what do we mean by that? Well, let's go back to our communication styles. If you remember, everybody has a different way they'd like to be approached in terms of how we're communicated. And we've already identified different types of communication styles. I will say it's not important, or I wouldn't say not important, but it's not vital that we identify the communication style of your client, but it's just something to be aware of, that each communication style might actually respect a different type of close. Okay, so remember, the directive is a goal-oriented person, and they're really ready to make a quick decision as long as they believe your solution meets their needs. So they might actually be more interested in more information-driven. They don't really necessarily need the support or the emotion associated with the presentation. Where an emotive is somebody that really needs social acceptance, so they would actually want some sort of support for their opinions, their ideas. So really important for them to be making really good eye contact, listen to them, to all their they might have more spontaneous statements, they may be less reserved, okay? Supportive, they're more likely to be slow in making the buying decision. So they might worry about certain risks. So that for them, it's really important to provide assurance, minimize that perceived risk. That would be helpful for them. Don't apply a lot of pressure because that actually might make them more indecisive. So it's really important to be patient with them. And the reflective, they also need some more patience, but they really like to see all the details. Okay, they're very much about factual information. They're very precise. So again, just a reminder that it is important to adapt that communication style to the person, especially now that you have a better understanding of who they are. Now, what happens when the buyer says yes? We get that final close, and it's a nice feeling, yeah? Absolutely. So this is the confirmation step in the closing sale. Okay, so before you leave, reassure the client by pointing out that they've made the correct decision. Describe the satisfaction that will come with the ownership of this meeting or this service in our hotel. And this is very good because we want to make sure that we don't prevent any buyer remorse. We want them to feel good about the decision they've made, and we don't want them to worry whether or not they made the right decision. So once the sale is closed, the customer may be required to justify the purchase to others. So remember that those words are reassuring. And this is why it's also reassuring to have a good sales presentation, because it's something that they can bring back to their association or the corporation, particularly if you have some very strong proof devices. And so really, really important is don't take for granted the sale. Okay, so make sure that you are appreciative, you're humble. That's going to be very helpful. I would also suggest in most cases to write some sort of follow-up email or at least a follow-up letter, just appreciating their business. So this is what happens when we say yes, but it happens also when buyers say no. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. But one thing you should confirm is make sure that the deal is truly dead. Make sure that there isn't any other way to convince them, okay, and that's fine, but we just want to confirm that. We want to go back and review some of the events, the sales process, see if there's opportunities for improvement. If we have the opportunity to interview the client, that can be helpful as well. And remember, we've built a good relationship with this customer. We're looking for a long-term relationship. We're not here just to make a quick sale. So it's okay for the buyer to say no. It could be that we just didn't have the right buying conditions. But having the opportunity to review and reflect, particularly having the opportunity, if you have that great relationship, to interview the client, they're more likely to be honest and getting honest feedback. So that's really helpful. But even doing a review of the events in terms of your own internal sales process, maybe there's an opportunity to improve that. Talk to TJ Mackey. Maybe he'll give you some insight. That's really valuable. So when the buyer says no, just be respectful. Make sure it is in fact a no, but also have the opportunity to learn from that and see what we can do to make it a yes next time. All right, so that's our video on the close. Here are some review objectives, pardon me. We will have some time to discuss further through our module. But again, this is a good opportunity for you to apply this into your role play. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you shortly.